So this week we're looking at Rosenbaum's essay, How to Be Dead and Not Care, a defense of Epicurus, which is kind of interesting. First of all, we started, of course, with Epicurus, and much of what we read has been an attack on Epicurus. That is, to be more specific about that, an attack on a supposed, well, not a supposed consequence, but one of the consequences of the Epicurean position on death, and that is that it's incoherent or unintelligible. It just doesn't make sense to say that when someone dies, a bad thing has happened to them for reasons that we've been over and for reasons that are rehearsed in this text. So it's interesting to read something that actually defends Epicurus. Supposedly it defends Epicurus, we'll see. Seems to, because so much of what we read and so much of, frankly, of everything that I've read with regard to Epicurus has been not a dismissal of him, but taking him seriously, has been an attack on Epicurus. So here we have a defense of the Epicurean position. I do not read Latin, but the epitaph begins this essay was worth translating. I had a student Google it actually one time. Non fui, fui non sum non curo, which apparently means I was not, I was, I am not, I don't care. That is, before I was born, I didn't exist, I was not. Then I was, that is, I was born and I existed. I am not, I'm dead, I guess. And non curo, I don't care. Which seems, first of all, it's funny in a dark humor sort of way, and secondly, it seems to me to be a perfectly credible presentation of the Epicurean position, and certainly something to keep in mind. And if you're going to go to the trouble of going through a death class, it's certainly worth learning something like that. So what do we have here? We have, again, an essay that is supposedly in support of Epicurus. And as it starts out, we're on very familiar territory, the first few pages. That is, there are some distinctions made about the difference between dying, death, and being dead. And I think that those are distinctions that we're familiar with at this point. That is, the dying process is not death. Now, what death is I would say, pretty ambiguous within Rosenbaum's essay. But I think the important thing is that he takes Epicurus' point, that is, that death is not a bad thing for us, as really to mean being dead is not a bad thing for us. Dying can be a bad thing because it can entail suffering. It can be unpleasant. It can cause us to be unhappy. But if we interpret what Epicurus says to really be about being dead, then the point is that being dead cannot make us unhappy. Being dead cannot be a misfortune because we don't have the capacity to suffer a misfortune once we're dead. Now, we know that there are many objections to this. That is, I would say the most prominent being Thomas Nagel's argument in his essay Death, and that is something that is referred to here. And I think that also, if we look at Rosenbaum's reconstruction of Epicurus' argument, which starts at the the bottom of 121 and moves on to page 122, we're also reminded of something that we read before the Silverstein essay. And I'm thinking of the so-called temporality assumption. And what Rosenbaum seems to be defending here is something very much like the temporality assumption. If I can quickly find that in The Evil of Death, that is on page 106, where he says an A relative value, that is a thing that has value for the person A, must have a temporal location or extent, at least part of which is prior to A's death. And of course that is what Silverstein was arguing against. But then if we look at the thrust of Rosenbaum's reconstruction of Epicurus' argument, the premises at least, A state of affairs is bad for person P only if P can experience it at some time. Therefore, B, P's being dead is bad for P only if it is a state of affairs that P can experience at some time. And then C, P can experience a state of affairs at some time only if it begins before P's death. Of course, it's not put in terms of value, it's put in terms of the experience, but we still get that same basic principle here, that whereas Silverstein was saying that for an event to have value, or for something to have value for a person, it must, at least in part, take place before the person's death. That's the temporality assumption that he was arguing against. Here it's put in a slightly different way, that the state of affairs is bad for a person only if the state of affairs begins before that person's death. It's very, very similar, and I think that Rosenbaum is both sort of assuming that as a very deep intuition we have, that is, for someone to experience something, that the state of affairs, something in the world, a happening, an event, an occurrence, but that occurrence has to begin, in the sense of has to partly at least take place before that person's death. And that is both a deep assumption I think we have in terms of thinking about the issue of somebody's life and events that they can experience, and it's also what he means to defend. Now, he himself says that the most ambiguous concept that he's employing here is the concept of experience. That is, that putting it in terms of being able to experience something, intuitively we have an idea of what experience is, but it's sort of a notoriously ambiguous concept once we begin to think about it. And I think that the key, or I would say the key point, the most interesting point in this essay really has to do with the conditions under which we could be said to experience something. That is, what has to be in place, what is a necessary condition for us having an experience of something. So let's just do another video in which we look at how Rosenbaum deals with that issue.